Let's dive in here. Donald Trump says these strikes at the weekend caused monumental damage to Iran's nuclear sites. First question, do we know if that's true?
I think we can assume that the president wound in some of his customary hyperbole. The Pentagon assessment is severe damage. The Israelis, I think, are still looking at it, and the International Atomic Energy Authority is still trying to make a definitive assessment, but also suggests severe damage. So in broad terms, I think the basic idea that they could use these penetrated bombs to cave in the holes in under the mountain in Fordo in Iran seems to have been validated by the strike they did. There are questions, though, about other Iranian facilities and to what degree does having tackled the ones the US did the other night in the way they did definitively halt that nuclear program.
Indeed. And look, Iran's ability to respond either with missiles aimed at Israel or US forces in the region or whatever, how intact is that?
Well, I mean, that's clearly been degraded little by little since the Israelis started with their strikes. It was felt that of the more capable and modern types of ballistic missile they had that could reach Israel, that the Iranians would have around 1,000 of those before this started. The Israelis, I think, are talking about having destroyed something like a third, probably a bit more than that by now. And of course, the Iranians have fired off, if I'm not wrong, something in the region of 300. So there are still enough for them to carry on. They fired about 20 last night at that sort of rate for a good many days still. And of course, they might try to use other weapons. They've been using some of their older or less dependable weapons as well to just try and keep this up. But yes, eventually they will run out of them or they'll get very low. And similarly, the Israelis could start to get low on some of the interceptor missiles they've been using to try and bring them down. It's a question of who feels the pinch first.
Yeah, and look, looking at the big picture here, Mark. I mean, there's a lot of sort of semi-ritualized debate at the moment about whether Iran was weeks away from a nuclear bomb, months away from a nuclear bomb, days away from a nuclear bomb. How much is that even the issue, and how much is this basically because Israel had a long-term plan to take out what it saw as the threat from Iran, and now was just the perfect time to do it?
I don't think that. Look, at the very outset, the first night, I think it was, the Israeli National Security Advisor said that the Iranian nuclear program could not be dealt with by military means alone. Now, some in subsequent days, because of some of the rhetoric used by some Israeli ministers, have said, well, maybe that's regime change. I'm still of the view that what they acknowledge is you will need to have some kind of on-site inspection. The Iranians, although they've made some claims about the UN watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Authority inspectors, they haven't thrown them out. They haven't withdrawn from that regime. So there is still a way that we could end up with some sort of agreement for Iran to halt its nuclear enrichment and put its program back under international supervision that would stop this and keep it under verification, but leave the regime still in place. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that both Trump and Netanyahu are still trying to push Ayatollah Khamenei in that direction. The real question now, I think, is whether Iran, having maintained this line for 20 years, that it's not going to give up its uranium enrichment activities, sticks to it until the very end, and tries to get back some kind of national pride and dignity after the pounding it's had, or do they just accept that this is going to be a necessary evil to stop the bombardment and ensure the regime survives?
And in as much as we can understand Donald Trump to have a foreign policy philosophy, Trumpism on the global stage, does he see this, do you think, as part of his big plan to sort out the Middle East that began with the Abraham Accords, getting countries to recognize Israel, with Iran being the sort of the roadblock to that kind of normalized Middle East? Or is that inferring too much strategy?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a view, and of course there are Israelis who take this view that little by little they've dismantled much of this axis of resistance, so called. This was the network of Iranian proxies, including Hezbollah in Lebanon. Of course, the Syrian government was part of this. That's fallen. The Houthis are the last real upstanding members of it, in a way, the only people who are still firing the odd missile in support of Iran and the Palestinians in Gaza. There have been some suggestions of a kind of grand strategy where if you weakened Iran, you could find things easier or find the pathway to some sort of agreement easier more broadly across the Middle East. I'm not sure I completely get that. I mean, the fact is the fundamental issue at the core of this, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, is not likely to be solved in itself by weakening Iran, even if the idea that losing Iranian support could be a big blow for an organization like Hamas.
There used to be a joke, I remember, at the time of the Iraq War that Saddam Hussein was so unpopular among many other Arab leaders that they were all singing the song Onward Christian Soldiers as the Americans went to take him out. I'm not sure that quite turned out to be true. But is there an element of that today? What do the Saudis think about what's going on?
Well, I mean, when the Israeli attacks started, they condemned them roundly, and Oman, for example, which has been using its good offices to host negotiations, was between Iran and the US back before this military offensive started. Oman even condemned the American strikes at the weekend, but most Gulf countries did not. And the US's traditional allies in the region, which would obviously be Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates principally, are probably very happy to see this Iranian nuclear program pounded. And not just that, the missile program as well, and the going over that the Israelis have given to the Iranian military industries more generally, all of which is regarded by the Saudis as a pretty serious threat to themselves. So there's no doubt that they would be happy that this had happened. But when you start to get into some of the escalatory scenarios, like this rumbling in the Iranian parliament yesterday about possibly closing the Straits of Hormuz, this key waterway through which so much of the world's oil exports go, including Saudi oil exports in large part, then I think, that they might start to get a bit more nervous about that.
Yeah, well, look, it's NATO's summit this week, and any other week we might have expected that to be the big news. What's going to be happening there? How much is that going to be dominated by this? How much is it going to be dominated by Ukraine? What are the various parties after at the moment?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We mustn't forget the summit later this week because it's a set piece. It brings Trump to Europe. European leaders get face to face with him. And have their chance to engage, how meaningfully that is in the forum of a summit. One would have to suggest perhaps not that meaningfully unless they get the old bilaterals, the one-to-one meetings on the side. Look, there are a number of big issues here. Firstly, the ongoing crisis in the Gulf. Secondly, Ukraine, as you mentioned. And thirdly, this big spending question. It's really important to kind of everything else the government in the UK wants to do over the next 10 years, whether it's going to sign up to these new targets, which is, to get from the sort of 2.5% that they've committed to reach of GDP or economic output, they've committed to reach by 2027, up to 3.5% on the military and 1.5% on military related things, which could be ports, some suggestion even that the UK government will count in rural broadband into that definition of spending. So that's a really tricky question, I think, for Keir Starmer and the British government, is how far are they going to say, yes, we'll do it, but under their breaths be saying, well, there's going to be some pretty creative accounting to factor things into those percentages in order to meet those targets, and indeed pushing things further down the road and not worrying so much about meeting them by 2035, thinking more about the public finances over the next 3 or 4 years and kicking the can down the road. But it is a really big question about the economy more generally and the priorities within the economy that the government will be facing this week.
And look, finally, Mark, other NATO countries, and particularly other European NATO countries, and us included, how much have we been sort of marginalised by the events of the past week, that we were so irrelevant to it that, Diego Garcia wasn't even used, we weren't consulted beforehand, we weren't involved? I mean, does the rest of NATO look terribly important on the sort of like the world stage right now, or not?
Well, I guess you're talking about European NATO,
Yeah.
effectively. Yeah, I think we have been marginalised. I think there's an open question, for example, as to whether the British government was also misdirected, to use the polite word, about the American bombers heading for Guam in the Pacific rather than to carry out their strike mission. I think they probably were told a fib by the Americans, which is pretty extraordinary. Well, look, on the other side of the coin, we had David Lammy and the German and French foreign ministers meeting the Iranian foreign minister in Geneva on Friday. Now, you might say, well, by then that was all an irrelevance. But I sort of think that if the Iranian foreign minister had said, yes, all right, we'll abandon our uranium enrichment, where do we sign, sort of thing, if there'd been a breakthrough, then I think something could have come of that. And so in that sense, we haven't become completely diplomatically irrelevant. But I think the government is very nervous about involving itself any more deeply militarily. And that inevitably means we're kind of not in the room when the Americans are making the military decisions.
Finally, Mark, are we at risk? Because there's various headlines this morning in some of the papers about how Iran's payback for all of this will be through terrorism, whether that's in the region or abroad. Are we more at risk than we were yesterday or the day before?
It's an interesting question. I mean, look, I think the events in Gaza over the past 18 months have had a radicalizing effect in some parts of Europe. There's lots of possible causes or things that might lead people towards more radical action. As to whether the Iranian thing specifically, well, there was this report of people being arrested a few weeks back, Iranians. They've now been released, apparently, but with the idea, the police alleged, of mounting an attack in the UK. I think it'll have to be watched very carefully. One would imagine that the security service and the anti-terrorist branch will be very closely watching this in case Iran decides that one of the ways it can retaliate is in third countries like the UK.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. Always a pleasure to speak to you. And you can, of course, hear Mark this time every Monday, and you can read him in the Sunday Times every week as well.